And so today I'm going to be talking to you about transformations of sign language intercultural mediation over time, and we'll be tapping into some of the key themes that this conference is structured around, and highlighting some of the work, the research work that's been done by others in my field, but also by my own research, to talk about essentially how important I think research is to provide evidence to create impact, and make a difference, and to transform people's lives, not only deaf people's lives in my context, but actually I think to transform lives in a multilingual and multicultural society. So I'm going to start off by talking about what I mean by transformative research, and then I'll frame the field with some key threshold concepts, and then I'll give some examples from different research in sign language interpreting studies, key research findings, and then at the end I'll sum up by talking about implications for policy, education, and some questions about future research. Seriously, I'd like to bust some myths. I quite often start with these slides, especially in conferences, generic sort of translation interpreting conferences, because this is a conversation I have many, many times over. So I think it's always worth setting the scene right from the beginning. So when we talk about language, the concept of language is actually a phonocentric concept. So the very word language actually alludes to use of the tongue. So when people talk about language, they often overlook the fact that signed languages are also languages. And there are many common misperceptions about sign languages. So many people think that they're just words on the hand, that signs correspond directly with words that are spoken, and that they operate in the same grammatical framework as spoken languages. So there's quite often a temptation to map sign languages directly onto spoken languages. But research that began in the 1950s in the United States and has then followed suit in many other countries has established that sign languages are very rich languages with their own grammatical structures, they're languages in their own right. There are relationships between spoken and sign languages in each country, but it is not a direct correspondence. So sign languages have their own grammatical rules and structures. And so I don't, for example, use Hong Kong Sign Language. So I've been watching the interpreters that have been working very hard during this conference, and I don't understand anything of what they're saying. Apart from, there's a couple of visual signs that I might recognise, but essentially it's completely different. So I'd like to assert the fact that when we think about languages and when we think about linguistic diversity, then we need to be thinking about signed languages in those conversations. And people often ask me the question, well, why isn't there one sign language? Why is there a different one in every country? Wouldn't it just be easier if all deaf people used one sign language? And then my response is always, wouldn't it be easier if there was just one spoken language? And which one would you choose? And then we'd all be out of a job. So we obviously value the fact that we live in a multilingual society, that different languages provides richness to our society, and we would argue the same about sign languages as well. There are language families, sign language families, so some sign languages are mutually intelligible, and they're related, quite often due to colonial administration. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand and South African sign languages are very closely related to British Sign Language, because the first people that set up deaf schools in those countries brought British Sign Language with them through the colonisation of those countries. And then we've seen the evolution of sign languages in different ways since then, but you can actually trace the histories back to those root sign languages, if you like. So there's actually an estimation of, by the World Federation of the Deaf, that there are 70 million deaf sign language users throughout the world. And this is not taking into account deaf or hard of hearing people that don't use sign language. That's an even bigger number, but this is people who choose to use sign language or prefer to use sign language for everyday communication. And the last time I checked, and that doesn't take into account, by the way, all the hearing people like myself. So I grew up with deaf parents, so my home language was British Sign Language. I grew up in London, and my grandparents were also deaf, so I was actually a bit of an anomaly in my family because I could hear. Everyone was like, what do we do with this person because they can hear? So when you factor in the fact that hearing people, there are many hearing people like me and others who work as interpreters or teachers with the deaf community, then that number is obviously a lot bigger. And when I last checked on Ethnologue, there were 157 sign languages listed, and to date, I think there are 46 countries at the time of this publication, which was almost 10 years ago now, actually. 46 countries had legally recognised their national sign language of that country in some shape or form, either through a piece of legislation or policy, and 20 had specific acts. So, for example, in the UK, we have 2. We have the British Sign Language Scotland Act from 2015, and actually just a couple of years ago now we have the BSL Act from the Westminster government in England in 2022. So British Sign Language has now been recognised as a minority Indigenous language in the UK. And the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of People with Disabilities has many mentions of sign languages and the fact that deaf people have the right to access services and education in sign language, in their preferred sign language, and that also to participate in society using a sign language. Okay, so that's got some of that information out of the way. I think that since I first began my PhD in 1998, and at that time there was very little research on sign language interpreting, and my experience was that discussions of sign and spoken language interpreting were very siloed, very separate, and I think over the last 20, 25 years we've seen a huge difference. We've seen a lot more interactions between researchers and practitioners, professional associations across signed and spoken language interpreting. I'm here as a keynote at this Translation Interpreting Conference, and we're seeing more of that happen. So we're seeing a lot more dialogue now within the translation interpreting profession and research and field. But I think that we still have a long way to go. I think we could do more. We're not seeing enough, I think, direct collaboration of signed and spoken language interpreting researchers actually working together on the same projects. We're still seeing them quite separate, but we do have a lot more exchange than we used to. So let's get to the meat of my presentation today. So one of the things I often talk about when talking about sign language interpreting research is the potential transformative nature, and I think this applies to studies of multilingualism and translation interpreting more generally. Because when we think about the transformative research paradigm, this means that we're really looking at ideas, discoveries, tools that really radically change our understanding of something which is important, and then that can create a new paradigm or new field. And it's the whole point of employing a transformative paradigm in research is it's really about centering the voices of marginalised communities. So not doing research on communities, but doing research for and with communities. And so this is a principle that I've adopted in my research for the last 20 years, being very cognizant of the fact that even though I grew up in the deaf community, I have the privilege of being someone who can hear. I'm a middle-class, well-educated woman, reasonably well-educated, and I'm white, and so I have a lot of privileges, and so I recognise that I'm fortunate to be here because of the fact that I had deaf parents and had deaf family members. I've been able to create, have a flourishing career as a result of my experience growing up. But it's really important to me to always give back to the community and work with the community to prioritise what the deaf community tell me are their needs, their priorities, and what they want me to do as a researcher. And one of the things I have found is that when you're doing transformative research, sometimes the results can take a while. The results can take a while to bear fruit. So the actual benefits of the results, the impact from your research might not really come to fruition for many years. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. So many of us will be familiar with the terms intercultural communication and intercultural mediation, and I think I found myself referring to the term intercultural mediation a lot more over the last few years. I've always positioned myself as a sign language interpreting researcher, but over time, because of just the way that research interests evolve, over time I've become interested in other things. So I sort of really appreciate this idea of intercultural mediation. So essentially that, my title as a professor is Chair of Intercultural Communication, which typically is really about how people adapt the way they talk to others. But intercultural mediation is when two people then bring somebody else in to mediate that conversation. So for us, when we think about intercultural mediation, that can actually encompass, it's a nice way, I think, to encompass interpreting, both consecutive, simultaneous, community, conference, and interpreting practices like in conference situations when you have pivot interpreters working through a relay chain of different languages, translation, obviously, translational practices. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen more discussions of non-professional interpreting. So, for example, ad hoc interpreting that perhaps takes place by people that might be bilinguals but not qualified in churches and many other contexts. And a part of that also being child language brokering. So the interpreting or the mediation that's done by children and young people for family members. And historically, that research was first done with migrant communities, but I'll come back to that. And many of you will be familiar with these threshold concepts in interpreting. So when we think about threshold concepts, these are the kind of really key, most salient topics that have been established through research, through evidence, and are discussed, widely discussed. So we talk now a lot more about interpreter-mediated communication, interpreter-mediated interaction, and there are many publications and debates around the concept of neutrality, impartiality, recognising now that interpreters and researchers demonstrated that interpreters are visible, they are present and co-participants or constructors of meaning, and they're very much part of negotiating their role and the interactions that happen. And there's some examples of some key researchers in spoken language interpreting who've really asserted these threshold concepts. So when we think about sign language mediation, which is obviously my specialty, the same principles apply, the same critical areas of mediation apply. So when we think about interpreting, we think about translation, there are discussions around non-professional or informal interpreting, and more recently I have been doing more research on sign language brokering. And actually, so it's a term specifically used to distinguish from interpreting, because the idea is that children or young people, they're not just interpreting, there's a lot more invested in the process of them mediating communication. And in sign language interpreting, in the field, we talk about the same threshold concepts around neutrality and role and co-participants. But there are other key things that we discuss a lot, and I think because of the power dynamics between deaf and hearing people, we talk a lot about that as sign language interpreters and the power and privilege that we have as hearing interpreters. We're also now, there's a lot more recognition that discussions around sign language interpreting should be deaf-led. We're seeing more and more deaf people become practitioners themselves as interpreters and translators, working in different contexts. And so we do talk a lot more about, I think, the sort of our role space, and how interpreters need to be fluid in their role. Then it's not as easy to it's not a binary distinction between whether you are on or off. As an interpreter, you don't step out of role, you enact your role in different ways at different times for different purposes. And so we have a lot of discussions around us being what we call a practice profession, a reflective practice profession, and encouraging reflexivity in practitioners. So I'm going to go through now sort of a bit of a virtual tour. Is it a virtual tour, a quick tour of some key sign language interpreting studies, research that's taken place, which I think has been transformative and that we can all learn from, some of which is my own. And as I mentioned earlier on, when I first started out, there was very little research in the field, and we've seen a real explosion, especially over the last 10, 15 years. I remember doing presenting a conference paper in 2007 where I had looked at how many papers had been published on sign language interpreting research in the last preceding 10 years before that, and I think it was about 100 papers, and now we've seen thousands produced since that time over the last almost 20 years. So we have seen a real explosion in this field, but there's still so much more for us to do. And some colleagues of mine, Lorraine Leeson being the lead author on this, talk about 3 dimensions to sign language interpreting, intercultural mediation or sign language interpreting research. And I think these concepts also apply to translation and interpreting research. And I'll be interested to know where you think we are now. So they suggest that there's sort of generation 0 where a lot of the publications have stemmed from practitioners reflecting on their practice, their critiquing their practice. So, for example, people would be very familiar with Danica Seleskovic's early work on conference interpreting, which was very much based on her experience as a conference interpreter and teaching conference interpreting, but it wasn't empirical in the sense that she had collected data and analysed data and put forward these threshold concepts that she proposed around sense and meaning making. It was very much from her experiences. So that would be called generation 0 research, where it's much more descriptive and potentially prescriptive. Then moving into first generation research is where we start to collect data and have an evidence base. It's empirical analyses to generate theoretical considerations, which then can be applied in practice and applied in teaching. And then second generation research would be, okay, well then how are practitioners adopting these theories? How are they applying them in their practice? How are students applying them in their learning? So I would say that at the moment, in sign language interpreting, we've definitely moved from generation 0 to first generation, and we are starting to also move into second generation research. But there's a lot more first generation research that still needs to happen. So now I'm going to focus on a few key themes that have been highlighted throughout this conference. There were so many of the themes that I could have tapped into, but I've just chosen a few that I felt resonated with me particularly, and also that I could draw upon my own research to talk about. So one of the thematic focuses for the conference is around children, and there's there's a body of research that focuses on educational interpreting. So the majority of deaf people are educated at what we would say in the mainstream, so they are integrated into local schools, and depending on the country and where you live and the location, there's lots of different factors that impact on where children are educated. But primarily, children would be perhaps the only child, or there might be a unit attached to a school, and the deaf children are integrated into the classroom, and they have sign language interpreters or sign language communication support workers of some kind in the classroom with them. And there's a body of research that has documented the experiences of deaf students and interpreters themselves. And one of the really interesting things about educational interpreting is that quite often we see interpreters working for very long periods of time on their own, and interpreters say that they don't feel that their role is necessarily kind of aligns with when we talk about interpreter role and what that means, that interpreters in an educational context, especially when they're working with young children, can't always stay in role because they're perceived in different ways by different people. Especially, I mean, if you imagine a young child looking at you and saying, "Can you take me to the toilet?" and then the interpreter saying, "I'm just the interpreter, that's not my job, that's not my role." The child is like, "Yeah, but you're an adult and I need to go to the toilet, so can you just take me?" Like, they're not necessarily going to understand the different nuances around an interpreter role. So there's been some really interesting work by Melissa Smith and Kim Kurz and a few others in the United States that have explored some of these theoretical issues. I've got a paper that's in press at the moment where we've been looking at educational interpreting experiences, and one of the things that we have been really interested in is whether deaf children have equivalent opportunities to participate in the classroom. So if you actually look at educational theories, question and answer responses between teacher and student is actually a really critical part of learning. So when teachers ask an open question, students respond, teachers can follow up with a student by name, or they can ask another open question. And so this actually facilitates the learning process by scaffolding learning. And this is an example here of some of our data where we filmed 11 hours of classroom interactions with high school students in Australia and actually analysed some of these question-answer sequences. And what we found was that the students were not getting the invitation to participate in the classroom in the same way that hearing students were. So a teacher would ask an open question, but because, as we know, there's always a slight delay, even if it's just a few seconds between what's the utterance from the teacher and what the sign language interpreter produces. So by the time the deaf student sees the question, another student has already called out the answer. And then the teacher's responded and said, yes, Joe, you're right. So what does that mean for blah, 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 blah? And the conversation has moved on. So what then happens is that either the deaf student doesn't respond at all, or when they do respond, the teacher says, yeah, we've answered that question already. That was like so 5 minutes ago, you know, maybe not 5 minutes, but, you know, that there's this, so then that perception of the deaf student is impacted. And so what we found was that sometimes the interpreters were using strategies to try and keep up, you know, and this is not a negative evaluation of what the interpreters were doing at all. It's about they were trying to do their best to keep up in the classroom so that the deaf student could keep up. So sometimes what they were doing was summarising those turn-taking Q&A interactions between teachers and students, rather than actually relaying the question so that the student had the invitation to participate. They were just receiving the summaries. So they're receiving all of the information, but not the opportunity to, and the cues to participate. So this has been a really significant piece of research, I think, because it's actually demonstrating that when we think about sign language access and deaf people's participation in society, and this is another debate in our field, is around what does access mean? Because putting a sign language interpreter in place does not mean that somebody necessarily has access. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have the equal opportunity to participate. It can be considered a kind of band-aid solution, and so we should be thinking more holistically about what we mean by access or inclusion and participation. Another aspect of my research is focused on sign language brokering, and so, as I mentioned earlier on, there has been a sort of advent of research around non-professional interpreting, looking at child language brokering, especially with families that migrate to new countries. There's a lot of research documenting how children and young people will mediate communication for their family members. Children tend to pick up new languages very quickly, so quite often they'll become more fluent in the new language of their host country than their parents. And so there's really great research by Rachele Antonini, Ira Teresi, and several others, Claudia Angelelli and others, who have looked at some of the implications of this for young people, whether there's this experience of brokering can be considered an asset, like it's a gift that they have, it's something they want to do, but also how there's potential negative impacts, feelings of shame, feelings of burden, that there's something they do from a young age. So I was really intrigued by this because having grown up with deaf parents myself, people would often say to me, well, didn't you interpret from a very young age? And I used to say, well, no, not really. And then I realised actually that I did, but it was always something that I offered to do. I never felt like it was a burden because my parents didn't ask me to do it. It wasn't something they imposed upon me. So I became intrigued by this and started doing some research on brokering young experiences of young people, but also talking to the deaf parents about how they felt about it when their children brokered for them. And again, found very similar themes to what we've seen in other child language brokering research. But one of the most interesting things I found was that young people told me that quite often they broker within their own families. And I know that we do see this with spoken languages as well. For example, if you've got migrants who move to a country and then their children then have children, so then what you get is that middle generation that might sometimes broker between their parents and their own children, who, if that heritage language hasn't been passed on. But what we see is quite often a deaf person might be the only deaf person in their family, because it's not always genetic. And there's lots of reasons why people are born deaf or become deaf. So at a family event, children might broker for their parents between their own family members, their aunts, their uncles, their siblings, and grandparents, and so on. And I think it's one of the things I've become really interested in recently is looking at what the natural instincts are of people that have grown up mediating communication like this, and what strategies they use, because I think that we often, the way we train sign language interpreters is I think we remove some of those natural instincts, or we don't harness those natural instincts about how you manage communication and turn taking between a signed language and a spoken language. I think that we need to be exploring those strategies and tactics that are used a lot more, and thinking about how we can actually embed them within training of what we call new signers, people that learn sign language later in life, and the strategies that they need to develop. Another theme of the conference this week is justice, and there's an emerging body of research in courtroom interpreting that's looked at the role of sign language interpreters in court. There's the leading researcher in this field is a woman called Deborah Russell, who's based in Canada, and her early PhD work, more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, examined the use of simultaneous and consecutive interpreting in court and which was most effective. Because sign language interpreting, by its very nature, one of the languages is silent, so you can see here at the conference the sign language interpreters are working simultaneously, and in most settings we do work simultaneously because there's not the clash of two spoken languages that you have. So in conferences, typically you would be using either chuchotage or you'll be using conference interpreting equipment. And in community settings, more typically you would find, again, chuchotage, whispered interpreting or consecutive interpreting. Whereas sign language interpreting practice is dominated by simultaneous practice. But Deborah Russell started to question that and said, well, in very highly sensitive situations like courtroom proceedings, sign language interpreters should be considering using consecutive because it might give them more time to process the information and sort of chunk the information, if you like, in manageable propositions for deaf people to take on board in these kind of highly pressurised contexts. One of my former PhD students, Christopher Tester, has also explored the role of deaf interpreters in courtrooms, because when we see practitioners who themselves are deaf, what they do is they can work either from text-based, so like auto cue in conferences, you'll see them working from an auto cue, like speech-to-text auto cue. So, for example, in this context, English into Hong Kong Sign Language. But they can also work intralingually between, in the same sign language. So, say, for example, if a deaf person who is experiencing mental health crisis or has other disabilities which impact on the way that they produce their signs, sometimes hearing interpreters will struggle to understand them. So a deaf interpreter will be brought in to mediate and to relay between whoever's speaking, the hearing interpreter working into one sign language, and then they will mediate to the deaf person. So it becomes like a relay chain. And in court, in some states in America, it's actually a requirement that a deaf interpreter is brought in to ensure that, because quite often we find that deaf people who are in the court systems tend to be less literate and have experienced some form of language deprivation, and so need that extra support by having a deaf interpreter there who can kind of relate to them as being part from the same community. So some really interesting research that's happening there, and this research is really impacting on policy and provision services of sign language interpreting in courts in many countries. And I've also done substantial research in this area, and one of the things I'm most proud of is probably the research with deaf jurors, where we started in Australia. It took about 10 years. It was a longitudinal study with several different studies, where, because many countries, such as Hong Kong and the UK, Australia, New Zealand, America, that have adversarial courtroom systems, criminal courtroom systems. So you have a jury that's selected, it's supposed to be representative of your community, and historically deaf people have typically been excluded from jury service just because they're deaf. And so I led on a series of studies where we investigated whether there was any detriment to the integrity of the jury process by having a deaf person on the jury with sign language interpreters. And we were able to demonstrate that actually there was no negative impact, and if anything, there were probably some positive impacts. So for jury deliberations, turn-taking could be managed more carefully if there were sign language interpreters in the room. And so we made a whole series of recommendations, which actually has led to law reform in 3 countries. So in Australia, the UK, and in Ireland, they've changed the law to allow deaf people to serve as jurors. So it's probably one of my proudest transformational research projects, actually. And the photo that's on your right-hand side is actually a publicly available photo of a trial that took place in London a couple of years ago, where a deaf person, the one who's behind the glass barrier, was called as a jury member and was selected, and so she had 2 interpreters working with her through the trial. So this was featured very heavily in the media as a breakthrough, a groundbreaking step forward in the justice system in the UK. Another element of the research I've done in court is looking at whether it's appropriate to use video relay or video remote interpreting in courts. And we tested out different contexts where we looked at whether the deaf person was in court and the interpreters were remote, or the interpreter was in court and the deaf person was remote, for example, if they were in prison, or if both the deaf person and the interpreter were remote together going into the courtroom. And we looked at all of the different configurations. And when we first did that research, it was back in 2011, and this was at a time when people were like, ooh, video remote interpreting, can it work? Does it work? Should we do it? How should we do it? What are the challenges? And everyone was like, oh, no, video, no, we can't possibly use video, especially not in courtrooms. And now, as we know, this is, especially since COVID, it's kind of a standard, right? For spoken and sign language interpreting, we're seeing the use of video remote interpreting really embedded in our practices, and especially in a lot more context than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago. But interestingly, from that project as well, it was the New South Wales, in Australia, the Department of Justice actually introduced trials to using video remote interpreting in their courtrooms. For certain scenarios, we made recommendations about length of time, nature of the trial, and so on, because there was such a shortage of interpreters, of sign language interpreters in New South Wales at the time. They couldn't meet the demand, and so lots of trials were getting delayed if there was a deaf person on trial. So this was a way for them to try and make sure that things could move forward. I've also been involved in doing research on police interpreting, and we were fortunate to get authentic data from Police Scotland. So Police Scotland, since I relocated to Scotland, has been a really critical partner in all the research I've done in the justice area. We've looked at police interviewing. We interviewed police officers, we've interviewed interpreters, and we were able to determine what the best practices are for police officers and interpreters to work together most effectively to ensure that deaf people aren't even further disadvantaged when they're being interviewed, either as a suspect or a witness or as someone who's being accused of a crime. And what we found was that police officers often were unsure what to do when a deaf person presented or was arrested. You know, how to call an interpreter, what criteria they should be looking at with interpreters, how to work with the interpreter, how to brief the interpreter. And the interpreters often said that they were reluctant to accept this kind of work because of the vulnerabilities, potentially, of the deaf people, and feeling in that context and feeling like they didn't want to exacerbate things if they were experiencing a crisis of confidence, I suppose, if they felt they didn't have the right level of training or expertise in the legal context. But what was happening then is that, again, deaf people are having to wait until they get interpreters. So this is actually impacting on the level of participation. So by working with Police Scotland, we were able to introduce a whole range of different resources for police officers, but also for interpreters. We did joint training, masterclass training, where we brought interpreters and police officers together to train together and learn from one another. And I think that's been some of the most impactful changes that we've seen, because police officers are actually, they're meeting deaf people in those contexts, they're meeting interpreters, talking to them, and we've developed all these other resources and toolkits to support them so that they can actually embed that in their practice. Following on from that particular study, we also did research around domestic abuse, and it was mentioned in the introduction, we've won a few different awards and recognition for this work, because again, collaborating with Police Scotland and really getting to and working with deaf survivors of domestic abuse, deaf women who've survived domestic abuse, and different practitioners who work with women in these contexts to understand where the gaps are, where the barriers are, and again, interpreters saying that they felt that they didn't want to do work in this area because it was too challenging, but then this impacting on deaf women's experiences. So, for example, an interpreter gets called, but they have to wait several hours. The interpreter finally arrives. They go through their story. Then the next time they have to appear for another interview or a court case, it's a different interpreter, and they have to start all over again. And if you imagine that, how a deaf woman feels, they've got a double disadvantage. So women who experience domestic abuse, I know that men also experience domestic abuse, but the majority of it is men against women. And so for women, that's been the focus of our research. And so women who experience domestic abuse are often in a vulnerable situation, and then deaf women who are experiencing domestic abuse have a double disadvantage in the sense that not only are they struggling sometimes to get away from their perpetrator, but then it's also about where they can access information, how they can access information, who they trust. And the deaf community is very small, so sign language interpreters and deaf people often know each other very well. There's always a risk then for deaf women to report domestic abuse because their interpreter might actually know their husband or their partner well in another context. So we were able to surface a lot of these issues and work in partnership with Police Scotland and other deaf community organisations to make recommendations for policy. So now Police Scotland has a whole range of information videos on their website about domestic abuse in British Sign Language. We developed a glossary of BSL signs for interpreters and for deaf community, defining domestic abuse concepts, because what we were finding as well was that a lot of deaf women didn't even realise that something that they were experiencing is classified as domestic abuse. So we've done a lot of work, and we're continuing to do more work at the moment. Our newest project is actually focusing on then how then that impacts on children. So if children are called upon, if you imagine a police officer is called to an incident of domestic abuse, turns up at the house, there's no interpreter, they realise that the person's deaf, there's no interpreter, and then the child that's there, or children that are there, might get called upon to assist with communication. What does that mean? How does that impact on the child, and how does that impact on the mother or the parents involved? So this is a current project we're working on at the moment. So I need to wrap things up because I just noticed what the time is. There's also been, health is also a topic of this conference, and there's an emerging body of research on healthcare interpreting which has looked at the importance of that as a relational practice in local GP appointments and in hospitals. And I've been involved in various research which, again, similar to the justice research, is looking at what the systemic barriers are for deaf people in accessing healthcare. And again, if an interpreter is provided, is that enough? So you might be able to get an interpreter in a GP appointment, but then what happens if you get diagnosed, for example, with, you're referred to hospital, you get diagnosed with diabetes, the consultant gives you a leaflet and says, and a website link, and says, here's some information about diabetes, and by the way, there's a diabetes support group that you can attend, and you should see a nutritionist. Who provides the interpreters for the ongoing support? Because quite often services are funded, sign language interpreting services are funded in the primary care provider context, so GP and hospital. But as soon as you move away from that context and looking at ongoing and maintenance of your health, interpreters are not provided and information is not translated into BSL. So lots of health services will have nice glossy brochures with translations into lots of different languages, but often they won't have BSL videos. That's starting to change, and some of the research that I've been involved in has actually made those critical points that information needs to be made accessible in as many forms as possible. The same with mental health. A lot of mental health interpreting research around sign language interpreting is focused on psychological therapies, counselling, and so on, but I've been fortunate to just be involved in a project that looks at the kind of intersection between mental health and justice and the legal sort of statutory requirements. If somebody is experiencing, for example, a psychotic mental health episode and needs to be admitted to hospital. We call it sectioning, where someone is under the Mental Health Act. There's a particular section that says that they need to be admitted to hospital for treatment, and there's an assessment that takes place. And so we've done some substantial work around how mental health professionals doing the assessments and interpreters of spoken and sign languages work together. So this is actually the first project I've been involved in, which actually has explored sign language interpreters and spoken language interpreters working alongside each other and their experiences. I think it's one of the few projects that I'm aware of that actually has involved both spoken and sign language interpreting researchers and practitioners. So again, we've developed a whole series of resources. We've worked with the Association of Social Workers in the UK, and we've actually submitted evidence for the considerations of the reform for the Mental Health Act in the UK. So we're hoping that there'll be more mentions of the need for collaborative interprofessional working between interpreters of any language and mental health professionals. So this is the hot topic, I think, for the conference, isn't it, really? So I saved the best for last, technologies. I mentioned earlier on that 10 and 15 years ago I was involved in doing research on video remote interpreting, and there's still research happening on video remote interpreting, but interestingly, the kind of pressure has shifted. So I mentioned that 10, 15 years ago, we were asking the question, should we even use video remote interpreting? And they were the kind of research questions we were exploring. Whereas now, it's not, should we use it? It's more, we're using it, it's happening. How can we make sure that we have best practices in place? What are best practices? How do deaf people want and need to access video remote interpreting services? Do hearing people understand how to use them? What are the implications for using video remote in some contexts and not others? But now the focus is now shifting to AI. Should we use AI? What's going to happen? How will it impact? All of these conversations we're having during this conference about spoken languages and translation, just as prevalent in sign language. And so you see this picture on your right. It's actually a screen grab from a video that was launched just this week by the NHS in the UK using AI. So the woman you can see signing in the right-hand corner is actually an AI-generated image. And when you watch her signing, it doesn't look natural. The flow is not natural. It doesn't really make sense. She has no facial expressions, which is where all the grammar information mostly takes place. So WhatsApp and social media has exploded the last week because this has been launched in the UK and it wasn't ready. People were saying, well, there should have been a human element. Who checked that this was comprehensible, that this was understandable? And there are clear guidelines, for example, from the European Union of the Deaf that say that AI shouldn't be used in medical or legal contexts, for example. So go to the post office to buy a stamp, fine, but not in where there's highly sensitive information or complex information being presented. So this is a very hot topic for us. And my colleague, Marcia de Mulder, who is based in the Netherlands, is actually one of the sort of lead. She's a deaf scholar herself, and she's one of the leading scholars now, really starting to push this agenda and ask these questions and really think about what the implications are for sign language users. And again, going back to that question of what is access. I actually published an edited volume 10 years ago now about interpreter education in the digital age, and proposing all of the chapters focus on how we can use technologies in interpreter education more efficiently, more effectively. And I can't believe that was 10 years ago. And I think we've moved on so much more since that volume was published, that we need, the way that technologies are emerging and evolving, this is a constant question for us in interpreting practice, but also in interpreter education. So to sum up, I've kind of highlighted different themes, and I think it is important, though, to recognise that these themes, these institutional contexts, if you like, don't operate in a vacuum from one another. There's integration, there's intersection between these themes. You have to think about the role of the interpreter in all of these different contexts. Is it the same? And also that somebody, for example, a child in a healthcare setting accessing support or information through video remote interpreting is having to negotiate all of these different layers of mediation all at once. So the research that we do, I think, also needs to reflect this complexity, and we're starting to talk a lot more now about interdisciplinary research, actually exploring intersectional factors, so taking into account intersectional characteristics. You know, do women of a certain age, of a certain colour, of a certain socioeconomic background experience interpreting in a different way, deaf women, than a man of a certain colour, of a certain background, etc., etc. And all of the research, I think, if it's going to be truly transformative, we have to informs our practice, it informs our teaching. And I still work as a sign language interpreter practitioner as often as I can, not very much these days, I don't really have time. But I do find that a lot of the questions that I have about research, that I would like to investigate through research, are evolved from conversations with deaf colleagues and friends, and like I said earlier on, what they tell me are their priorities, but also through my own practice as an interpreter, observing challenges that I experience in my own practice. And then I have conversations with other interpreters who say, yes, I experience the same things. So like, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's do some research on this. So I do think that sign language interpreting studies have been transformative, the research that we've been able to do so far. We're seeing, this is a volume just published earlier this year, which actually documents international perspectives on sign language interpreter and translator education, but actually places the education in each country that's featured. We have 24 chapters in the book, and from across the globe, and we asked every author to situate the educational context within the wider translation and interpreting industry, if you like. And it's great now that we can see that because of the research evidence that we've had, it's led to the establishment of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, to standards, accreditation in many countries, although we are still seeing the evolution of the profession in many countries. So I saw a really interesting presentation here 2 days ago about the evolution of sign language interpreting here in Hong Kong, and the professionalisation and the fact that there's still a need for more formal training and recruitment of interpreters to work in this country. So I'm going to skip over to my last and critical point. Really, that research evidence is really effective for advocacy, for pedagogy, and for setting standards. How we educate interpreters matters, and I think drawing on evidence of practice and also perceptions and policy implications really does inform the way that we educate. And relationships between practitioners and researchers is essential. So it's been really heartwarming to see here how many people here are practicing scholars, practicing translators and interpreters and scholars, or both. And we have representatives from professional associations as well as researchers interacting together, because I think that's where we really make the difference, by having these dialogues together. And partnership working is really paramount. So a lot of the research I've been able to do has been transformative because of the partnership working with key stakeholders, working with deaf community organisations, with sign language interpreting professional associations, to really engage and enact difference. And I think my last point really speaks to the point that Mona made yesterday in her keynote around longer term systemic impact, and that having research happening provides an evidence base, fosters critical engagement, and that's actually where we make the longer term systemic impact. So we've run out of time now, but these are questions for you to take away. So what issues remain unsolved? Where does the research go from here? How do we balance values around partnership, ideas that we have for research, blue sky thinking, where we can get funding to do research, what ethical tensions that might be, especially around emerging technologies, and how can sign and spoken language interpreter researchers and practitioners be more integrated, and what can we learn from one another? Thank you very much.